he was going to Belgium to collect the inheritance from a relative who had died recently. She said that she'd been staying home and taking care of their 3 kids since then and hadn't heard anything from him since he had left. To Overton, this explained why Hippolyte was found in Senlis, because Senlis was about halfway between Paris and Belgium, so clearly he was on his way to Belgium. However, as he was internalizing this new information, he was interrupted by a very loud gasp. And he looked at Alphonsine to see that she had sort of broken out of her muted state and was staring at him with really wide eyes like something huge had just occurred to her. And she told him, maybe her husband had been on his way back with all the money he got from the inheritance. And she said, maybe he was killed by a robber. Now, Overton, he considered this, and a robbery did make sense to him. Hippolyte was very well dressed, and there hadn't been any money in any of his pockets. But this whole interview with his wife just felt really off. Alphonsine didn't seem at all confused or rattled or upset in any way. And now, just literally moments after finding out that potentially your husband has been brutally murdered, like he's dead, she's begun pitching theories of how he was killed, like she was trying to point the finger at someone else right away. It just felt off. Now, to Overton, Alphonsine did not really seem like she could have been the one to actually kill Hippolyte herself. She's clearly here alone with 3 young kids, and this took place in Senlis. And more than that is Hippolyte was a pretty big guy, and he clearly had been overpowered by somebody or maybe multiple people. And, Alphonsine was quite small. However, if she was involved and maybe hired someone to carry out a hit on her husband, well, that would cost presumably quite a bit of money. And considering, the low quality nature of where they lived, it just seemed unlikely to Overton that she would be able to afford paying a hitman. And so at this point, Overton didn't think that Alphonsine was a particularly strong suspect, but at the same time, he couldn't completely rule her out. However, one thing he was definitely sure about, just based on a gut feeling here, was that Alphonsine knew something more than she was telling him. That night, when Judge Overton got back to the courthouse in Senlis, he walked down the hallway toward his office and saw a police officer waiting at his door. And this officer told him that they'd arrested a man that afternoon whose name was Etienne Bouillot for the murder of Hippolyte Hoyos. Overton's heart began to race, and when he heard Etienne was in a holding cell in the jail right next door, he told the officer to take him there right away. As they hurried down the hallway and out of the courthouse, the officer explained to Overton that a group of police had been out at the crime scene near Senlis collecting evidence, and at some point they'd passed Etienne sitting in the woods nearby. And as soon as he saw the police approaching, Etienne had just started running. And so the officers had chased him down and they had caught him, and when they did, they noticed he had blood on his pants and on his jacket. They also found a bloody handkerchief that was in one of his pockets. Now, the officer said that Etienne had claimed he was hit by a cart the night before, and that was why he was covered in so much blood. But the police were just not convinced, especially because Etienne refused to give them an alibi for where he had been the night Hippolyte was actually killed. And so the officer and Overton, they get to the jail and they go inside, and when they reach the holding cell, Overton saw Etienne sitting inside, and he was wearing very shabby clothes and looked like he might be homeless. And so Overton, he goes inside the cell, and Etienne, he's just sitting there, he's not saying anything. And Overton, he just sits down and begins going over all the evidence that they had. And a lot of it made it seem like Etienne was their guy. And at some point, when Overton was done sort of going over what they had, he told Etienne that, "You're basically our only suspect at this point." So unless he could give Overton an alibi for the night of November 2nd, the night that Hippolyte was killed, then unfortunately, Etienne was very likely going to be charged with murder. At this point, Etienne just sort of looked down for a moment and then let out this long, defeated sigh, like the reality of his situation was really settling in. Eventually, he looked back up at Overton and he mumbled that he did have an alibi. He said he had spent the whole night sleeping at an inn in Chantilly. He said the reason he hadn't told the police this is because he actually left the inn without paying. And that's also why he had run from the police when he was seen in the woods. He thought they were there to arrest him for theft. Overton looked hard at Etienne. He wasn't sure if he believed him, but he wrote down the name of the inn and planned to go out there and verify Etienne's alibi first thing in the morning. A week later, Judge Aubertin walked down a street in Paris, in the same working-class neighborhood where Hippolyte and his family lived. He was on his way to check out a lead that he really hoped would reinvigorate his investigation, because over the last week, the case had completely stalled. Etienne's alibi had checked out. The inn's owner verified that Etienne had stayed there that night, and at some point he had left without paying. Now, this did not completely rule Etienne out, because he could have left his room without anyone noticing to go commit this murder, but it did make it seem much more likely that Etienne was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And since Etienne, Aubertin hadn't gotten any more tips about this case until that morning, when he'd gotten word that one of Hippolyte's friends was missing. This friend was a Belgian farmer named Louis Baron, who had come to France to work with Hippolyte. And this friend, Louis, hadn't been seen in over a week. Basically, since the murder, he's been missing. And so to Aubertin, the timing here was just too perfect to be